Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest today is Jordan Sparks, the founder and executive director of Oregon Brain Preservation, OBP, which is located at Salem, the capital city of Oregon. OBP offers the service of chemically preserving the brain in the hope of future restoration. Previously, Jordan was a dentist and a computer programmer, and he was successful enough in those fields to generate the capital required to start OBP. Brain preservation is a fascinating subject that David and I have covered in a number of recent episodes, in which we've interviewed Kenneth Hayworth, Max Moore, and Emil Kendziorra. Most people whose brains have been preserved for future restoration have undergone cryopreservation, which involves cooling the brain, and sometimes the whole body, down to a very low temperature and keeping it that way. OBP does offer that service occasionally, but its focus, and I think it's unique here, is chemical fixation of the brain. So Jordan, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Jordan.
Jordan, how did you first get interested in brain preservation?
Well, I learned about it when I was in college 30 years ago. I was immediately hooked. My interest has only grown over time. After dental school, I started building equipment and facilities for use in local emergencies. I naively thought at the time that some local volunteers could perform this procedure. That's not the case. It's more complex than I thought it was.
And can you remember the moment when you first decided to found Oregon Brain Preservation? Was it a eureka-like epiphany? Did you leap out of the bath and run around the town?
I've been involved for 30 years. I started taking patients 10 years ago. It was part of a long process of continual improvement. By that point, I already had lots of equipment and facilities. I knew it was a big responsibility to accept patients, so it's not something I even considered at the beginning. It's a significant step. And so at that point, 10 years ago, I knew I had the resources to keep it going. And so I thought it was time to take that step. But it's just been a gradual process, really.
And were you a dentist at that time, or a computer programmer, or both?
So in 2000, I graduated from dental school. I immediately started doing programming on the side because I didn't like my dental software. I did a 10-year transition from dentistry to software, so I'm still a licensed dentist, but my full-time job at the moment is software. That's how I make my money, and then I pour that money into the science company, and I hire scientists and employees over there to keep that going. So I don't really personally spend my time anymore in research. I thought that's how I was going to do it, but it's a much better arrangement for me to try to make the money and have other people do the research.
And can you describe how chemical preservation of the brain works, in contrast to cryonic preservation, and also why you focus on chemical rather than cryonic?
Yes. Chemical preservation is very routine in science. Every microscopic photo that you've ever seen of a brain is chemical preservation. Think about that. We have 70 years of history of constantly and regularly preserving brain tissue. At Oregon Brain Preservation, we do the exact same thing that scientists do. We use standard techniques that any scientist would be immediately familiar with. So I think of what we're doing as very mainstream. Cryonics is a little harder to explain. If you go back and you read the early cryonics literature, it's obviously based on the idea of suspended animation as used in science fiction. That's the idea that a person that was preserved could be rewarmed and revived, like they didn't really die in the first place. And that mindset, it's not universal among cryonicists, but it's strongly represented. Most cryonicists think of what they're doing as being on a spectrum of early suspended animation. That's why you hear them talk about organ banking and trying to revive small animals. It's all science fiction nonsense, and I just reject that approach completely. I think it's very damaging to claim that there's any relationship to suspended animation at all. This isn't Buck Rogers or Austin Powers or Han Solo or something. Suspended animation is fake. It's like anti-gravity. Now, there are a number of people in cryonics who don't treat it that way. They treat it more like just the actual physical preservation of the molecules. And when you think of it that way, it's a simple physical preservation. The person's clearly dead, but the molecules have been preserved so that you could reconstruct those memories in the future. And when you think about it like that, it turns out that a cryopreserved brain and a chemically preserved brain, the quality is identical. Both of them are preserving the structure just fine. They're equivalent. The thing is that cryonics is doing it in a way that's ridiculously expensive with no additional benefit over what we're doing. So it's silly to talk about cryonics because scientists just roll their eyes. They know it's not reversible in the way that the cryonics is portraying it. And so if we focus on aldehyde fixation instead, we avoid all of that. We use a technology that scientists deeply respect. They'll still reject it for other reasons, like it's too far in the future to matter to them, but that's just a lack of imagination. That's not the same as the visceral rejection that you see with cryonics.
Jordan, you say that cryopreservation can't be reversed, but aren't there examples of embryos, sperm, eggs, and in some cases even kidneys of small animals that have been cryopreserved and then reanimated?
Totally different. Any scientist will tell you it's totally different. Any scientist will very comfortably tell you that suspended animation is over 100 years away. It's just absurd. The technology to preserve a single cell or a small cluster of cells, there's no way you can expand that to large organs. As I think it was Kenneth Hayworth was talking about in one of your previous podcasts, it's the rewarming problem. You get ice crystals. It's impossible. Trust me, the technology that would be required to separately rewarm all these different tissue types and properly get the cryoprotectant into all those different types of tissue in the first place is way, way, way beyond our current technology.
So are you saying the problem is here and now, that we can't cryopreserve properly, putting the fluids into all the parts of the body? Or are you saying it's an unsolved problem for the future, the rewarming? Because after all, there are lots of research projects into using microwaves or other systems, ultrasound, I think, which might do the rewarming at some stage in the future.
So cryopreservation is 2 stages. First, you use the chemicals for cryoprotection and you cool. That's stage 1. Stage 2 later is the rewarming. Stage 1 is a lot easier. And that's why I said that the current cryopreserved brains, the quality is fine. You're preserving everything when you do that. That's not the problem. And even though you can't really get the cryoprotectant into all the tissues in the right way, you're still doing a pretty good job. It's not great. It's an 8-hour process, and you've killed the cells after about an hour. So there's a lot of damage there. And there's no way you're going to bring all those dead cells back to life after all the damage you've caused. But a much bigger problem is the rewarming. And we just can't solve that with current technology. There's lots and lots of big problems. Possibly they've done some cryoprotection of sheets of cells, small groups of cells. I think they've done some trachea or bladder tissue or some skin cells maybe, but you just can't do a whole person.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Did you know that 95% of digital products fail within their first year of launch? Discover what makes the other 5% succeed. Brought to you by the leading digital product agency Infinum, Delivered is your window into innovative business solutions powered by technology. Each month, we interview business leaders and innovators behind successful digital products to unbox their success strategies. You can find Delivered wherever you get your podcasts.
Do we need to be able to do it now? Isn't the idea that people might be cryopreserved for decades or so, or even centuries? And in due course, the technology of rewarming will have improved, that people can be reanimated.
Yeah, but you've rewarmed a dead person. You still have to have all the technology to do all the repairs. The repair is very, very extensive in both cases, but it's at the molecular level. The information is still there. The connections of the brain are all still there. It's just that all the molecules are all broken. and not functioning anymore. And you can't just turn that back on. Even if you rewarm it, you've just got a pile of broken molecules. You have to go into that cell, trillions and quadrillions of atoms, and you have to fix all those proteins and all of those molecules. It's an enormous proposition.
So when you cool down a brain using cryopreservation, I thought earlier you were saying that that part is reasonably achievable.
Yeah.
It's a bit messy, but you basically can create a preserved brain. We have no way whatsoever, and it's a long way off before you could reanimate it. But just now, I think you were saying that the cooling process itself will cause a hell of a lot of damage. Is that right?
It's such a complex topic. So imagine different kinds of damage. You've got big damage and you've got small damage. So let's take a painting as an analogy. If you rip a painting in half, can you reasonably, with some technology, repair that someday?
Yeah.
Yeah. You just put it back together, you glue it together along the seam or something like that. Now, if you go and splash some solvent on that painting, and maybe the painting still looks pretty decent, but at a microscopic scale, you've blurred everything. Much harder to fix. So the kind of damage I'm talking about is like some sort of solvent that damages all the fine detail, but it leaves the painting largely intact. So you can still see the original painting, but the fine detail is so damaged. There's just lots of different kinds of damage.
And you would argue that kind of damage is caused by the cryopreservation cooling, but is not caused during chemical fixation. Is that right?
No, you also get that small damage during chemical fixation. For one thing, the person is dead. The cells are still alive. The person is dead. That's a complicated issue right there. It's hard to get the chemicals in quickly enough to lock the molecules in place. So you're just going to get a lot of damage. When you chemically preserve, you're cross-linking the molecules. That's a good thing because you're locking them in place so that future technology can see where they are. That's wonderful, but they're still broken. Just like they are with cryopreservation, all those molecules are broken in both cases. In both cases, you have to have a technology that can either go fix all those molecules, or, as Kenneth was proposing, you skip all that complexity and you just fire it up in software. That's a lot easier.
The impression I got from Kenneth was chemical fixation is a proven technology, as you were saying earlier. We know it works. But the way to reanimate the person, reanimate the mind, would be necessarily to upload the information into a computer and then restart the mind inside the computer, because it would be almost impossible with foreseeable technology, perhaps not in far future technology, almost impossible to unpick all the chemical bonds that the chemical fixation makes. And I think he was arguing, or maybe it was Max Moore was arguing, that with cryopreservation, you don't have to break all those bonds that the chemical fixation makes. So in theory, you could, again, with distant technology, you could reanimate the brain without uploading. But you're arguing that there's just too much damage and you couldn't reanimate the brain.
Well, I think he was trying to explain a complicated topic in a short amount of time, and I would rephrase what he said. I think he was talking about a certain point in the future. Let's imagine 100 years from now, when uploading has just become available. I'm saying 100 years, even taking into account exponential growth. It's that complicated. 100 years from now, we've got uploading. Now, at that point in the future, when uploading is first possible, rearranging molecules in a preserved brain will still not be possible. It'll take a few more decades of exponential improvements until you have the microrobotics available to actually rearrange molecules. So uploading becomes possible decades before physical repair. And so what he was just saying was it's easier to do the software. Yes, you can still do the physical repair a few decades later, but it's always going to be easier to do it in software. And that's the case for both cryopreserved and chemically preserved brains. It's the same complexity to do the repairs. In both cases, it doesn't matter. The preservation is equivalent. And because it's going to be so much easier to do the repair in software, nobody's going to care about physical repair. They just won't care. People are more pragmatic for that. As soon as uploading becomes available, we're going to be very familiar with very high-tech computers by that point. We're not going to hem and haw about, is it really me or not? That's a solved problem by that point. There's not going to be a duplicate problem. None of that is really an issue. Once uploads are a reality, everybody's going to become pragmatic very quickly, and they're going to be, oh, I'm going to be saved by just uploading. That's not an issue. For example, if you think that you would make a duplicate of yourself, I don't think you would, because you'd have to split your net worth. Nobody's going to do that. It's ridiculous. If you have a duplicate, you would just remerge the two back together again so that you keep your net worth intact.
Unless we've got a type of economy in which people don't really need to earn resources because almost everything is virtually free, which possibly it has to. We may have to get to something like that when we get to full automation, when machines can do everything that we can do for money. We're going to need that kind of economy.
People could be very wealthy by comparison to today, but there's always going to be fighting for resources. This isn't that far in the future. 100 years from now isn't really that far away. And I'm pretty confident that we're still going to have lots of money controlling a lot of things.
Jordan, what reaction does the rest of the cryonics community give to your ideas? Are they saying, hey, this makes sense, but I'm going to stick with my own ideas because that's what I'm used to? Or do they have good arguments against what you've just been outlining?
It's funny, there's so much inertia with anything. It's a pretty big leap for somebody to accept cryonics in the first place. They think they're open to new ideas, but it takes decades to really change your mind about something, even if you're really trying hard and thinking about it. The older people tend to be still in the cryonics mindset. It tends to be younger people who are getting on board with chemical preservation. I feel like there's a lot of new energy with young scientists going into this industry.
And the people that you have already preserved, the patients going back 10 years, are their brains subject to this aldehyde process that you've mentioned?
Yes, so we have 16 patients, and we have not been trying very hard. Really, we've been telling people, don't call us. We've been downplaying. That's how I work. Of those 16, 4 are cryopreserved. And lately, as I've moved away from cryopreservation, it's been very easy to convince people to do chemical preservation rather than cryopreservation because it's essentially free. Of course, money is always an issue with everybody. And when we explain to them sincerely that we feel like the quality is essentially the same and there's no advantage to the cryopreserving, and then we follow up with, if you do the chemical fixation, you can always later upgrade to cryopreservation. That's just another step you could take if you wanted to spend another $30,000. That gives them options. Like a lot of people, they really are interested in the cryopreservation, but maybe they don't have the money right now and they need a year or two to get it together. And so they like the idea of a phased-in approach.
Why would someone want to do cryopreservation after they've done chemical? Because as I understand it, the only possible advantage of cryo is that you won't be creating these molecular bonds, which happens with chemical. And therefore, there's this idea, I know you don't accept it, but the idea that you could reanimate a cryopreserved brain in a way that you can't reanimate a chemically preserved brain. So what would be the point of doing cryo after chemical preservation?
Robert McIntyre, I think it's been almost 10 years ago, he did the experiment with Greg Fahey for aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation. And that's the one where they did the chemical fixation followed by cryopreservation. And that's what got a lot of people thinking. That's where they got the really good results. That's what won the Brain Preservation Foundation prize. People latched onto this idea of, I want cryopreservation. This lets them have that. It's another option. I suppose there is some merit to the idea that maybe chemical preservation alone could degrade over time. You've got a lot of strong molecular links, but yeah, it's still in a liquid. In theory, I suppose you could have some ongoing damage of some sort. We don't know 100%. So the thinking is cryopreservation really does vitrify the entire volume. And we can do that here. We've done that in a few cases. We do the fixation followed by cryopreservation. And then you really do have certainty that nothing's going to change for thousands of years. It really is locked in place. But I don't think that there's really any advantage. I think when you get those molecules all locked in place with fixation, those are covalent bonds, especially with the glutaraldehyde. That's basically how you tan leather in some cases. I mean, it just lasts forever.
And what are the costs of this fixation process? And I guess there may be also costs for a standby team. If somebody is in the process of dying, you probably still want to get to them quite soon after they died rather than waiting whilst their brain deteriorates.
Our services are free. We subsidize them to some degree to let that happen. Especially in Oregon, Washington, Northern California, it doesn't cost us that much to send a vehicle out. And since we do 100 body donors, cadaver donors a year anyway, it's just another case. The cost is not significant. So essentially it's free. Now, if we fly somebody out to the East Coast, it could be up to $5,000 just for the cost of the transportation and airlines and hotel and so on. And so we have a staff of 4 specialists who know how to go to a remote location and remove a brain and put it in formaldehyde. But that's not really the best scenario. The best scenario is you take a person who's still alive and you pump those chemicals into the arteries while they're alive, euthanasia, and that's how you get the best preservation. When you're talking about somebody who's already dead and you have to cut the skull open to get the brain out, clearly the quality is not as good, but it's the best we can do, I think. We're trying to work on doing it quickly, getting there as fast as we can. Standby teams is a whole nother thing. I suppose if the person wants to pay for it, it could run into tens of thousands of dollars additional. That's kind of a separate issue, the standby.
As I understand it, your preference really would be to have somebody move to where you are, Salem. And in Oregon, euthanasia is legal. So they could arrange for themselves to be euthanized. You pump the chemicals into their arteries while they're alive. That's the best way to do it.
Right. So in Oregon, we have the Death with Dignity Act. And I'm expecting at some point for euthanasia to become legal. I'm pretty excited about that happening. I hope it happens in my lifetime. Once that happens, we're going to be in a very good place. We will be able to dramatically improve the quality of preservation. The dying process is just so damaging to the brain, and it makes our job so much harder. So yes, if we can pump the chemicals in while they're alive, if that's what the euthanasia process is, and it's allowed by law, you could get some really good preservation. Now, the preservations that we're doing, how do they compare to that good quality that I'm talking about? That's an unknown. One of our major research projects is to try to quantify how much damage is actually being done in these cases where we're not doing the ideal scenario. We're kind of optimistic that the quality maybe isn't too bad, even in the mediocre cases. I mean, if you think about it, you have brain banks throughout the United States that have been collecting brains for decades. Of course, the brains haven't dissolved or something. They're still completely intact, or the brain banks wouldn't be doing research on them. They do research on these brains all the time, looking at the tissue and the ultrastructure. And so clearly there's a lot of detail still in place, even in just kind of an ordinary brain bank. Like at Harvard, if they need a brain and somebody dies somewhere, somebody not in Massachusetts will remove the brain, they'll mail it to Harvard. Harvard stores it in their brain bank and they do research on it, and it's great. The condition is good. So we're pretty optimistic that even in those non-ideal cases, we're preserving most of the information.
Of course, you won't really know until it comes time to reanimate somebody via uploading or whatever, and we'll find out whether the information has been preserved well enough. But obviously I misunderstood, because I thought the Death with Dignity Act made euthanasia legal in Oregon, and that's not true.
No. Euthanasia is when a doctor kills a patient. Death with dignity is when the patient, unassisted by the doctor, takes pills. Basically, they're committing suicide in a way rather than being killed. It's the same thing, of course, scientifically, but our society feels better about it or something if the patient does it themselves. It's kind of ridiculous. They kind of need to move past that and let the doctors do it properly.
Would it not be possible if I came to you and said, I want my brain to be preserved, and I swallow a few pills, so I'm killing myself, nobody else is doing it, and I press a button that starts pumping the aldehyde into my veins, is it not possible to do it that way?
That's a good idea. We have a room in our facility with a patient bed in it where you can take the pills. It's right next to our procedure room, so we would wheel you over and do the procedure. Unfortunately, you have to be pronounced dead by a professional in Oregon before we legally get possession of the body.
But couldn't I initiate the infusion process? As long as nobody else was doing it, as long as I'm doing it, that would be legal, wouldn't it?
That's a really complicated question. It's fascinating. Who's going to put the catheter into your arm exactly? If a physician did that with the understanding of what it was going to be used for, he would go to jail. So, yeah, I suppose it could be. I just can't quite imagine the scenario where you could get away with it.
So you'd have to be unsqueamish enough to stick a catheter into your own tubes. Mind you, if you're on the point of killing yourself, at least in theory, it shouldn't be too hard an idea.
Well, but then you've committed suicide because the only allowed way to do it is with those pills.
Ah.
So instead of depending on the pills now, you've done a different way of suicide. That's illegal. Now the body goes to the coroner and is stuck there for 2 days where they cut up the brain and try to determine the cause of death and decide who to prosecute. I mean, it's just a mess.
And you couldn't put the catheter in, start the pump going, and then swallow the pills quickly. So that was definitely the cause. You'd be creating a legal mess. I can see that.
What you could do is you could jump into an ice bath as you take the pills. And that would slow your metabolism down, and you would still die from the pills, but you would be hypothermic at the moment when you died, and that would sure help a lot. You get a huge reduction in metabolic damage if you do that. I've thought about that a few times, but it's pretty painful to get into an ice bath.
Yeah.
Let me ask about the research that you're doing. You say you have cadavers being donated, maybe 100, did you say, a year?
Per year, yeah.
So why do people make these donations? And what kind of research do you do on their bodies?
So there's a large industry in the United States for whole body donation. This is different than donating your body for organs and tissue. If a young person dies in a motorcycle accident, they would donate their organs, kidneys, lungs, Achilles tendon, things like that. They would donate tissue into living patients. A totally different donation in the United States is body donation. These are old people. Nobody wants their tissue. All the organs are failing, but they donate their body to science, and it's very, very useful. They use these bodies in medical schools for dissecting. They use them for some things that make people squeamish, like ballistic testing and motor vehicle dummies.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you have to have real bodies to actually determine how damaging certain motor vehicle accidents are.
Wow.
And to science in general. That's how Harvard gets those brains for their brain bank. So when people donate their bodies to science, it's a huge service to science. It's very necessary. You've got the football players donating their brains because they know that they've got chronic traumatic brain injuries. That helps us research. So we're part of that industry. We're part of the body donation industry. And the reason people donate is it's pretty simple. They want to help advance science, and we'll do the cremation for them for free. So it saves them a little bit of money and simplifies things for them. We have plenty of people who are just fine with that.
And what do you do with their bodies and brains?
We remove the brains and we do research on them. That's how we get a feel for how to do perfusions of the chemicals and what kind of quality the brain is in after a certain time post-mortem. We know exactly when the person died. We know when we brain. We can look at it under an electron microscope and characterize the damage. We're interested in the brains. We cremate the remainder of the body.
How many other organizations in the world are offering the same services as you? So if somebody is listening to this and they're located elsewhere in the world, what are their options if they would like their brains to be chemically preserved as you've just described?
We're the only organization so far that is doing chemical preservation. I suspect that there's going to be many more soon. I'm aware of one other that is trying to start up, but it's hard, it's expensive, it's very expensive. And so we're going to just keep forging ahead and doing really good research and trying to demonstrate to the world that this is the path forward. We're hoping that when they see what we're doing, they can make that leap of imagination and they can think about starting their own organizations and how maybe it's not as hard or complicated as they thought it was. And they can see it as a good idea. It just brings the cost down. We could be saving tens of thousands of lives if people would just get on board with this idea instead of resisting it. I don't see any reason not to be preserving these brains. It would be such a service to humanity. Because of the distance problem that we have, I think you need these organizations sprinkled around the country and around the globe. And so we're trying to convince others to do what we're doing. And I think that we're going to see some progress. I'm excited about the future.
Have you spoken to Emil at Tomorrow Biostasis about this?
Oh, yes. He came and visited us here once, and when I have the time, I'll go visit him. We talk all the time. I've laid out my proposition for why I think he should just switch to chemical. Like I said, it takes time. He's a smart guy, but it still takes time. When a new idea comes in, your brain has to reorganize it and reframe it in a way that makes sense to you. And maybe the third time that you hear it, you'll be like, oh, that's a good idea, but not the first time. So I think he's warming up to it. He seems to be of the mind now that they do chemical preservation in situations where they think that it makes more sense. So I think he's coming around. I think some of the others are not. There's a lot of resistance from people at Alcor, for example, but they tend to be an older group of people. I just kind of attribute it to the inflexibility of humans to think about new ideas.
And while you are unique in the world, if somebody decides, hey, I want to do this, I want to have my brain chemically preserved, what steps should they take? Should they contact you and get on a list? Do you have a list? Do you have a membership scheme? How does it work?
Well, I have a hard time answering that. I don't know how to help everybody. I suppose they could move to Salem as a first step, because that would solve a lot of distance issues, but nobody's going to do that. We're gradually opening up to allow membership. That's never been my focus. I actively discouraged membership for many years. My goal has always been a good preservation for myself. And honestly, if I drag some people along with me, that's just icing on the cake. I'm much more focused on research and improving techniques. I'm more interested in working on cadavers and learning what I can from all of that instead of trying to get more members. It's probably just part of my philosophy in life to underpromise and overdeliver, kind of like the opposite of Elon Musk. I just detest vaporware. So I'd rather spend decades building a good product and then finally letting people use it, not the other way around.
I can imagine somebody with an advanced cancer who knows that they have got a few months to live, and they're not going to be very pleasant months, thinking, I'm going to move to Salem and I'm going to have my brain chemically preserved. Would you discourage them from doing that, or would you welcome them and say, come on in, the service is free, it's all great? Should they just write to you and apply?
I've been really discouraged over the years when I see certain people who need to get preserved. Like, there was a guy from England about 10 years ago, got ALS at a young age, and it was just devastating. He posted pictures of him with his young wife and his 2 young kids, and we watched him just go downhill so quickly over 1 or 2 years. And then he was begging for help. He wanted to get preserved, and the lowest cost out there was like $32,000 or something. They tried to crowdfund it, and I think they might have succeeded. I don't remember. But that's part of what motivates me. I've seen it happen so many times where they needed brain preservation, they wanted it, and there was nobody able to provide it. So absolutely, we're trying hard to fill that need. It's a huge need. And so, yes, if somebody like him had contacted us, we could have arranged something. Probably what we would have done in that case, because it was over in Europe, is we would have had somebody remove the brain over in Europe and preserve it over there. Any pathologist at any hospital knows how to do that. It's a very standard procedure, removing a brain and putting it in formalin. So we can have a talk with the pathologist and get that going. Any of those people would have a pretty good prognosis. I think there would be some brain damage in the form of, if they were to be revived, they might have a few damaged memories or something. But for the most part, the way that memories are stored in your brain, they're not just in one spot. They're kind of holographic. The one memory is kind of stored everywhere. And so I think artificial intelligence can reconstruct a lot of those memories by inference, by knowing about the person's life and memories from other people around them. You can rebuild a lot of that. The person's personality, for example, is largely encoded in their DNA. So you can get back a lot of who they were, even in a slightly damaged brain. So we are here and ready to help anybody who needs it. And we will do our very best to try to help them, even if they don't move to Salem like I suggested, because I know that that's not really practical. I know most people aren't going to do that.
Well, like I said, if you are nearing the end of your life, then moving to Salem doesn't sound really such a massive obstacle. If you're ready to go, you might as well go from Salem as from Surbiton in England.
It is a massive obstacle, though, because at that point in your life, you're very sick, you're not thinking clearly, you're weak, they won't let you onto an airplane because they don't want you dying on their flight. You've run out of money because you just spent it all in the hospital. I mean, it never happens. Nobody ever does it.
Yeah. Well, actually, in Europe, you don't run out of money because we have socialist medical care, as it's seen in America. But anyway, I can see it as a tricky thing to organize. Jordan, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you very much indeed for joining the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.